we should probably take this window fetch mock and move it somewhere more general so it can be used for all of our integration tests, because pretty much every time we do an integration test, we're going to be hitting the Bootstrap endpoint. Anytime we load up a book screen, we're going to be hitting this endpoint. So we've got a lot of work to do. We've got tons of endpoints that we're hitting. We need to implement all of those. But I'm not actually super happy with the way that we've implemented this anyway, because it's not really complete. It's not giving me confidence that we're making window fetch calls correctly. For example, what if we made a put request to the Bootstrap endpoint rather than a get request? Maybe we added that, or maybe we made a typo or something. Then there's no way currently to differentiate between those two. We'd have to add additional logic here to verify the config. And there's plenty more where that came from. It actually gets pretty messy. So I'm really happy that MSW exists, and we've actually already configured it for a previous test with our API client. And here's how that works. It's simply grab setup server. We grab some server handlers that we've configured already. We set up our server, and then we set up our server to start listening before all of our tests. And after they're all done, then we close the server so we're no longer listening. And then between each test, we just get rid of all of the runtime handlers that were added for the specific test. And we just reset it to the server handlers that we initialized it with in the first place. Now, these server handlers actually already exist because we've been using them this whole time as we interact with our application. We use them for development. This makes our development time really fast if the backend hasn't actually implemented a endpoint yet, or if we want to work with this offline, or maybe the backend server is down or something, we still want to get some work done. Having MSW set up for us makes the development experience really nice. It also allows us to have some really cool dev tools here where we can control exactly what our backend is doing, because it's all a mock backend during development. And it's really easy to switch this off so we can verify that this all works in production, and our end-to-end tests, we'll probably want to hit production for those. But for our integration tests and for our regular development workflow, this is really nice. And because we've already made all of this stuff up for our development workflow, we can just reuse all of this same stuff for our tests. Now, with the way our tests currently work, we just create this user and then we send that user in our mock fetch API. But if we're going to be switching over to MSW, we need to have some mechanism for MSW to know what to do when we make this Bootstrap request and to know where to get this user from. And the way our MSW server handlers do this is they interact with these fake databases that we have for our development. So we can take these exact same modules, interact with those modules, and then MSW will be able to retrieve our user and our books and our list items straight from those databases. So let's start out by getting rid of this window fetch mock. And because we have things already set up to listen for the requests that we're going to make, if we save this, this should actually hit our server handlers for MSW, which it looks like it does. So we're off to the races already. Now we just need to make sure we put a real legit token for a real legit user into local storage to fool our auth provider that we are logged in, and so we can use that same token when making our requests. So let's stick this user in the database. We'll say await users db create user, and then we need to get a token for this user. So we're going to say our auth user equals await users db authenticate with that user. And then the auth user has a token. We can stick that token in here. And then for the book, if we're going to be loading up this book page, that book needs to be in the database as well, so MSW can retrieve its data. So we'll say await books db create build book. Now let's save that and see where that lands us here. All right, great. So far so good. The next problem that we come up against is adding MSW to the mix makes things take just like a tiny little bit more, like maybe another tick of the event loop or something. So it's not really anything to be concerned about because it is just a fraction of a millisecond longer. But because of that, we actually get rid of the loading spinner, and then we have our book loading indicators here that we need to handle as well. And so I'm going to enhance this to actually wait for a bunch of elements to be removed. We want all elements that are labeled loading and all elements with the text content that matches loading to be removed before we continue with our test. So I'm going to turn this into an array. We'll spread the result of this query, and instead of get by, we'll use query by, and we'll use actually query all by label text, and we'll do query all by text. So everything that's labeled loading or has the text content loading should be gone from the page before we continue to make our assertions. So let's save that, and hopefully this passes, which it does. Awesome. So we're in a really good place here now because we can make as many of these tests as we want, and we've already got all the endpoints our backend makes mocked out, so we don't have to worry about it. Now, this does take a fair amount of time to build out, and there are ways to generate these kind of handlers depending on the standards that your backend is implemented in. But in general, it's absolutely worth the effort because it makes writing integration tests so easy, and it makes development time a lot better as well. So one other thing that I want to do here is, because we're creating things in the database, we should probably clear that between every one of our tests to make sure that every test starts with a clean slate. And so we're going to add await users db reset, and we'll do books db reset as well, and list items db reset. And then we've got all of these. They're not dependent on each other, so I'm actually going to say await promise.all, and we'll just have all these go off at the exact same time. And there we go. So now we're cleaning up after every one of our tests as well. So let's review what we did here. We had a window.fetch mock right here that we just wanted to get rid of because it wasn't giving us enough confidence, and we swapped it out for the test server that we already had configured for a previous test that we set up. And that was configured to have all of these server handlers that were already written so we could handle every request that our application makes. And these server handlers interact with a database, and so for us to get our tests set up before we actually render our app, we interact with that database ourselves as well. And then we also want to make sure that we're in a good non-loading state before we continue with the rest of our test, so we enhanced our wait for element to be removed to make sure we're no longer in a loading state. And then we also cleaned up after each one of our tests.